Chapter 6. New York City, July 1975. 10 plain, high-backed black chairs were set behind a long boardroom table in the center of a raised dais inside Manhattan's fancy Rainbow Grill. They held the promise of an important event. Dozens more chairs were arranged to face the dais. The setting was informal, the mood businesslike. Then a phalanx of reporters was let in. They struggled for seats and good camera positions and then waited for something to happen. Music blared. Jackson 5 tunes alternated with songs by LaBelle and Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. Surefire dance cuts, only no one danced. Then a frizzy-haired publicist from the record company paraded in front of the newsmen, her high heels clicking on the linoleum floor as she moved across the crowded room, opened a side door and ushered 11 members of the Jackson family, single file, towards the high-backed chairs. The faces were serious. No one smiled. Joe, dressed in a slick black suit, at one end. He was followed by his wife, Catherine, and LaToya, Janet, Randy, and Rebby, who held her own daughter, Stacy, and then Jackie, Tito, Marlon, and Michael. Conspicuously absent was Jermaine Long, the group's sex symbol, who was back in LA with his wife, Hazel Gordy. But the purpose of the press conference shed light on the missing Jackson. According to the STEM, somber patriarch, speaking in a slow, measured tone, music's #1 family had signed a contract with Epic Records and would leave Motown on the expiration of the contract, in March 1976. Why? A reporter asked. We left Motown because we look forward to selling a lot of albums, Tito answered. Motown sells a lot of singles, Joe added, but Epic sells a lot of albums. Michael, 16, the real star of the group, who was wearing a black velvet jacket and plaid waistcoat, was then asked how he thought the move would affect him. I'm sure the promotion will be stronger, he said. Joe and his oldest sons, now fully grown men, exuded a proud bravado. On the dais, they held their heads high, the chests forward, and the comments, optimistic and confident, resonated an anything's possible attitude. Michael was just the opposite. Painfully shy, awkward in front of people, uncomfortable, he looked as if he wanted to disappear. His eyes fluttered downward, locking on the tabletop. Only occasionally did he glance up and then, it appeared, only to see if the conference was over yet. Someone asked if the Jacksons had tried to renegotiate the contract with Motown. Sure, we tried to renegotiate with Motown, Jackie snapped. But the figures were just Mickey Mouse. Single quote. It was a shallow answer to a deep problem. A problem that had been brewing over time. A problem that was aggravated by the increasing maturity of the Jacksons themselves. A problem that only got worse when the Jackson 5's last few Motown albums failed to produce a substantial hit single. A problem rooted in two very stubborn men, Berry Gordy, Jr. and Joe Jackson. A problem that caused a deep, unsightly rift in the intensely loyal and close-knit Jackson family. It didn't have to be that way, Joe says. No, I don't think it did. Single quote. The schism between the Jacksons and Motown, particularly Gordy, came to a boil when the Jacksons recorded the Dancing Machine album. Basically, the guys wanted more creative control over the sound. They felt they were lagging behind contemporary trends, so far behind, in fact, that Michael felt they were in danger of becoming a nostalgia band, and this before his 18th birthday. The Jacksons wanted more input in the writing and producing. Not unreasonable requests, especially by artists of the stature. But Motown disagreed. Their answer was firm, no. Also on the table were a spate of accusations that Motown had unjustly withheld money owed the Jacksons. But money wasn't the main issue here. I wanted to stay with Motown, Joe maintains. The boys wanted to stay with Motown. The only reason we left was that the label wasn't giving the boys a chance to do what I knew they could do, and that's write their own material. It showed they didn't have any confidence in us. If they would have let him write just one song on the next album, it would have made the boys feel much better. Single quote. Michael was asked to confront Gordy directly, and their one-on-one discussion brought the bitter negotiations to a head. The face-off required the teenager to summon every last ounce of courage and fortitude in his spindly frame. But Gordy didn't agree, or wouldn't, and the summit between the two superpowers amounted to nothing. Being at a record company is like being at school, Michael explained later. If you're not happy with the principal or the school, you go to another. At Motown we wanted to do our own writing, but that wasn't in our contract and they wouldn't give it to us. We didn't have publishing rights, either, and we had trouble getting a proper accounting of our money. Single quote. In a brief period of time, Michael had acquired the equivalent of a college-level business degree. Using himself as an example, he had studied first-hand the creation of a product, its packaging and marketing. He had learned about management and quality maintenance. And he realized that everything boiled down to one basic ingredient: control. An idea that quickly became basic to his way of thinking. Michael knew that success depended on him controlling the reins to his own career. He just wasn't in a position to exercise that sort of power. Yet. Michael always had his own idea of how things should be done, Marlon says. But the Jackson 5 was a group, not his special project, and his was just one vote. Single quote. If nothing else, the Jacksons have always been egalitarian. To this day, they make most major decisions in family meetings. In these conclaves, held over simple dinners at one of their homes, they all voice opinions, engage in debate and then decide a particular matter by vote. One vote per person, no matter who has sold the most records. In the early summer of 1975, they gathered in the living room of their recently purchased Encino estate to decide the future. Everyone in the family was present, except Jermaine. If he would have been there, it would have caused an explosion, a family associate says. There was little discussion, family members recall. Michael, who kept his thoughts to a few words, felt in his heart a loyalty to the label that had shepherded him to fame and fortune. But when it came time to vote, all hands were raised in unison in favor of leaving Motown. Several days later, Joe telephoned his third oldest son and asked him to stop by the family's house, without his wife, please. When he arrived, Jermaine didn't have a clue about the latest developments and he strolled inside the large house as if nothing were wrong. Joe's face told a different story. He ushered his son into an empty bedroom where a pile of contracts were spread out. There were 4 signatures on each one: Jackie, Tito, Michael and Marlon. All they needed was Jermaine's. They saved me for last because they knew I'd be trouble, he says. He was shocked. Quickly, Joe attempted to explain as well as to persuade his son to go along with the plan. Epic, he said, was part of CBS, the biggest record company in the world. The executives at CBS had told Joe they'd make the Jacksons the next Beatles. There was also a lot of money involved, including publishing interests, as well as Epic's enormous marketing machinery, which would be at the disposal. According to Joe, the offer dwarfed Motown's. It didn't matter to Jermaine. He recoiled in absolute horror and ran out of the house without saying a word. His Rolls-Royce screeched out of the driveway and stopped up the street at the nearest pay telephone, where he called his father-in-law. Gordy, who was also hearing about the group's decision for the first time, was equally shocked by the dramatic news. Well, how about you? He asked his son-in-law. What are you going to do? I didn't sign, Jermaine replied. And I won't sign. Single quote. In the midst of this tumult, the family, including Jermaine, flew to Las Vegas, where the Jackson 5 were headlining at the MGM Grand. Their act, a combination of rock, nostalgia and middle-brow comedy, now included Randy on bongos, a song or two by LaToya, and an hilarious Mae West impersonation by an 8-year-old Janet, who showed a natural stage flair by slinking out in high heels and a tight, fitting, sequined dress and winning howls from the audience. On stage, they looked a seamless unit. Offstage, however, the Jacksons were a family divided by conflicting loyalties. Their dressing rooms simmered with hostility. Several times Jermaine and Jackie lit into each other in heated disputes over the merits of one record company versus the other. The biggest fight was over publishing. Jackie felt the group deserved their own while Jermaine towed Motown's draconian line. Jermaine felt more and more ostracized, an enemy within his own family. I never knew my family would take it so hard and show that towards me, he says. That's when it really hurt. Single quote. The dispute reached a nasty conclusion one night only minutes before the Jacksons took the stage. Gordy telephoned backstage and told Jermaine not to go on with his family. He was finished with them, the Motown chief said, and he should pack up and leave. We were surprised, Marlon says, really in shock. But we had a show to do. We really didn't talk about it. We knew what we had to do. Single quote. Michael didn't say a word. For him, the situation was utterly frightening. Everything for which he and his family had worked so hard for so many years had suddenly been put in jeopardy. But his place was well defined. He had long ago accepted the responsibility for providing whatever the family lacked. When their dreams hinged on signing a record contract, he worked harder. When he wanted his mother to join the family in Los Angeles, he worked harder. Michael's solution now was exactly what it had always been. We worked harder, he says. At the end of their performance, the Jacksons earned, and received, 3 standing ovations. The Jacksons filled the brief period of transition between Motown and Epic with their own network television show. Michael hated doing the show. I don't know why, Joe ponders. It helped him a lot. It told the world he was a good entertainer and let everybody see him. I had all the children on the show. I thought it was a good thing to do, not forever, but for that time. Despite strong misgivings, Michael was outvoted by the rest of his family and he agreed to go along with the show. He believed the series would only overexpose the Jacksons as well as damage whatever musical credibility they retained. He also loathed the costumes they had to wear and the short sketches they had to perform. Though Michael has a good sense of humor, he's never considered himself a comedian. Even so, when it came time to work, he performed like a pro. I never knew Michael hated the show, comedian Biff Manard, one of the show's writers, says. If he did, he disguised it well. Single quote. Michael would usually slip into the studio by himself. He'd sometimes come into my office, says Manard, and ask, "Did you write anything funny today, Biff?" Quote. The only segment of the program taped live was the musical performance and it was the only time when Michael seemed to spark. Nothing went down musically without him, Manard recalls. It was a trip. He was pure magic. The kid did a 360-degree turn and became a whole other guy. Otherwise, he was very shy. True to form, Michael exhibited his Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde act. With the family, he was always alone, Manard says. Michael would wander around the hallways by himself. Or if he was with the brothers, he always stayed in the background. But once they started with the music, from the opening note, Michael was in the front. Even in the wings, he was downcast and shy. I'd say, "Gee, you really look good tonight," and he'd barely say, "Thank you." But then, on stage, forget it, the pot boiled over. Single quote. Fortunately, at least for Michael, the TV series lasted just 1 season. Then it was back to business. The group, rechristened the Jacksons since Motown retained ownership of the moniker Jackson 5, began recording their first album for Epic. Production chores went to Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, who had created the soulful Philadelphia sound of the early 70s with steamy dance tunes like the OJs, Backstabbers, and the 3 Degrees, When Will I See You Again? Listening to and watching experienced pros like Gamble and Huff pound out the demos on the piano and then stitch together the songs on vinyl taught Michael advanced lessons in songwriting structure, melody, production. The process was all beginning to come together. In the backyard studio, the guys had started writing and producing their own songs and demos. As a result, the jazzy Blues Away, written by Michael, and the hard jamming Style of Life, written by Michael and Tito, became the first 2 Jackson originals to make it onto an album. In 1976, Epic released the first Jackson album, The Jacksons. 2 singles, Enjoy Yourself, which hiked up to 6 on the charts, and Show You the Way to Go, which only went as high as 28, carried enough punch to power the disc to gold record status. The following year the Jacksons turned out the second Epic album, Going Places, which included 2 more Jackson originals. However, the album, a carbon copy of the first, showed little growth and took them nowhere. The CBS people didn't really understand the mechanisms of how to promote a young group, Joe grouses. That was the reason. Things began to open up a little when they got the boys more involved. Single quote. In 1977 Michael planned a special outing for the 4th of July. There's not much a 19-year-old superstar can do without attracting attention. But with Janet, his constant companion, and the pal Kim Fields, then 8 years old, the effervescent actress from TV's Facts of Life, Michael arranged a trip to Disneyland. Infused with childish excitement, he thought of everything. At 5 a.m., up pulls this Rolls-Royce, Fields remembers. My aunt and my mother were breaking their necks looking at the car. Then out jumps Michael wearing a safari hat, sunglasses, jeans and a shirt. Single quote. He was smiling, eager. This wasn't the man-child who harbored worries of sales figures and future projects. No, today he was carefree, a kid going out to play. He had reserved a room at the Disneyland Hotel so he and his pals could rest during the long, hot day. But Michael bounded from ride to ride, a bundle of unreleased energy. He rode the Pirates of the Caribbean, his favorite, over and over again. People hardly recognized us at all, Fields says. Such happy-go-lucky days were few and far between, though. His face was still broken out and he worried about his appearance. His brothers, detecting his sensitivity, chided him by calling him Big Nose. He hated the nickname. And when he wasn't nursing these psychological wounds, Michael fretted over the wreckage the Jacksons called a career and wondered how to go about salvaging it. He spent countless hours with his brothers in the backyard studio, writing songs. He was always working on a song, Joe recalls. Or he had his nose in a book. Michael had always been a voracious reader, and once compiled a list of his 10 favorite books. His choice revealed a restless character searching for something to satisfy an emptiness in his soul. His choices ranged from the pseudo-spiritual Jonathan Livingston Seagull to the sweet The Red Balloon to the surprises of O. Henry short stories. All are simple reads. Yet the first 2 titles on his list, The Greatest Salesman in the World and The Gift of a Cabba, both odd, inspirational, and obscure Horatio Alger, like novels written by a former Metropolitan life insurance salesman named Og Mandino, testified to Michael's compulsive do-or-die drive for success. The worries in his mind never eased. By his late teens, Michael's personal development was on hold. He had long ago turned inward. His own mother had even yielded to his insistent will, suppressing her instinctive alarm when he refused to eat on a daily basis. But he hadn't yet shut himself completely off from the world. There was, for instance, an early teenage crush on one of Smokey Robinson's nieces. He called her a girlfriend, Marlon says. We used to talk about her all the time, but it was just giggle time, really. Single quote. The drug culture didn't escape him, either. Despite his insulated upbringing, simply by being in the music business Michael couldn't help but come into contact with drugs like marijuana and cocaine. We were offered drugs all the time, Marlon says. But we never took them. Tito, for instance, hosted a wild rock and roll party at his sprawling Encino house and a famous performer was in the back room snorting coke. When Michael and Marlon strolled in to investigate what was going on, he didn't make any attempt to cover up his illegal activities, but smiled kind of sheepishly and warned the brothers, stay away from this. It's bad for you. Single quote. However, there were things Michael couldn't avoid. His bashful nature, high voice and gossamer physique gave rise to a slew of unsavory rumors. The most talked about tale pegged Michael as a homosexual. Scuttlebutt linked him with songwriter Clifton Davis. Do you believe that magazines have been writing that he and I are getting married? Michael told an interviewer, revealing his naive astonishment. I know it's not true, so it doesn't bother me. Single quote. Another hot rumor making the rounds at that time had Michael in seclusion in order to undergo a sex change operation. I was in a Sears store buying some records while on tour when I first heard about it, he told Soul magazine. This one girl came up to me, saying, it isn't true, it isn't true. I said, what isn't true? And she said, you're not a girl. I said, what? Where did you read that? Quote. The mean-spirited fabrication was even printed in Jet magazine. I felt like I knew who I was at that moment, Michael explained. But things like that are a sign of success. The truth is, Michael was greatly disturbed by the underground rumblings concerning his sexuality and the startling fact they had made it into print. When I first heard the rumors that he was gay, I thought I'd go crazy, Katherine Jackson said. He's my son and I know the truth. He knows the truth, too. We both talked about it and cried about it. Michael was very hurt by the rumors. He was young and he didn't want anyone else to be hurt. How did this affect Michael? Aside from intensifying his already phobic relationship with the outside world, he developed a distrust of the press that continued to grow for several years until he finally stopped communicating with them altogether. He developed an on-guard behavior about the press, former Motown publicist Gene Shelton says. Weird is more like it. He started taking Janet with him to press conferences and using her as his mouthpiece. Michael just stood in front of reporters with his head bowed or gazing off into space and refused to make any eye contact. How are you? He'd be asked. Then Janet would ask him, how are you, Michael? He would whisper in her ear, and Janet would answer, fine. Single quote. The charade was a disquieting spectacle. It was unbelievable, Shelton says. I couldn't believe that was really going on. I would have to sit through several of these sessions. It was unreal. Maybe he was trying to be a star, but the behavior was absolutely ludicrous. Aside from Janet and LaToya, Michael had few people to whom he could confide his secrets. In terms of experience, he was an untainted child swimming in a sea of adults. On the outside, he sparkled, sure. And the sounds he made were giddy, joyous, upbeat ones. Inside, though, Michael was an empty barrel, a 19-year-old bundle of stress and anxiety. On the cusp of adulthood, his life had no clear direction and this discouraged him. Without a hit record, upon which his whole identity and self-worth hinged, Michael floundered in a quagmire of confusion. His credo remained the same as always, hard work. But on what? That was the question burning in Michael's mind when the opportunity arose to audition for the part of the nimble, acutely insecure scarecrow in The Wiz. Although the $20 million production was financed by Berry Gordy, the big-time power broker didn't harbor a grudge against his former protege when director Sidney Lumet cast him opposite Diana Ross, who was Dorothy. The film also featured Richard Pryor and Lena Horne. Michael was thrilled and more than ready to tackle something other than music. He had been mulling over various options, he admits. In analyzing his choices, he worried about repercussions, which suggests that he was already considering leaving his brothers in favor of the solo career interviewers were constantly pestering him about. The Wiz offered him an alternative, without encroaching on his musical career. Essentially, it bought him time as well as a change of scenery. An all-black, contemporary send-up of the fantasy classic, The Wizard of Oz, The Wiz was filmed in Manhattan. Michael, who hadn't lived apart from his parents since he and his brothers had alternated bunk beds at Ross and Gordy's Hollywood mansions, moved into a plush, high-rise apartment in the exclusive Sutton Place area that cost $2,000 per month. LaToya accompanied Michael to prevent the hermit-like teenager from leading too solitary a life away from the set. He couldn't be left alone, and he didn't want to be. After all, here was a young man past voting age who still tucked his napkin in his shirt collar, didn't know Hack Quiche was, didn't yet possess his driving license, and scolded himself when he was informed that the Vice President Gerald Ford had, in fact, become president after the Watergate scandal forced Richard Nixon to resign. Boy, I gotta keep up on these things, he reproached himself. For his movie debut, Michael received lots of good tips from superstar thespians Sidney Poitier and Ryan O'Neal, the father of his first serious girlfriend, Tatum O'Neal. He had met her shortly before leaving Los Angeles in On the Rocks, a private club on Sunset Strip. The evening had been a typical, laid-back Hollywood party, the guest list fast lane. In addition to Michael, his brother Randy and two publicists from Epic, Susan Blond and Steve Manning, the revelers included actors George Hamilton and Tony Curtis, George's ex-wife, Alana Hamilton Stewart, who had remarried rock star Rod Stewart, Ryan O'Neal and his daughter Tatum, a child performer like Michael who had won an Academy Award at the age of 7 for her work in Paper Moon. Michael was sitting at a table when he felt a small, soft hand take hold of his. He looked up and saw it was Tatum's. When it came to socializing, Michael had not yet come of age. His voice was still high. His face was still broken out. And he still cringed when his brothers called him Big Nose. He was accustomed to being grabbed by girls on tour. When the Jacksons had played in London in 1972, nearly 10,000 fans were waiting for them on the airport tarmac and Michael had escaped by standing on top of a Rolls-Royce until the police cleared the area. But he wasn't used to being touched in a romantic way by pretty young ladies, and when Tatum's gentle hand rested upon his, Michael's heart melted. On the first official date they went to Hugh Hefner's Playboy Mansion, an enormous stone castle in Holmby Hills, with a reputation for being an orgiastic playground. Inside, the rooms were generally dark and full of leather furniture. The rambling backyard was home to Hef's envious collection of exotic animals, not the least of which were the many shapely young women who regularly lounged topless poolside in all the pneumatic splendor. Halfway through the movie they were watching, Tatum, then 15 years old and light years ahead of Michael in sophistication, led her more innocent date outside for some fun and relaxation in the backyard. Discarding the clothes, they slipped into the hot tub. In recounting the incident, Michael says they had the swimming suits on. But mansion insiders say they were indeed skinny dipping. Consequently, the bare facts remain buried in a frothy sea of bubbles but Michael's sexual preference seemed clear. I can't tell the details of that evening since I wasn't there, Marlon says. But Michael definitely isn't gay. He's not as innocent as people think. With Michael in New York, this relationship with Tatum continued through long-distance telephone calls. Most of Michael's time was spent on a set. It took 5 hours every day just to apply his scarecrow makeup. Despite the tedious process, he loved watching himself disappear under layers of clownish paint and then slipping into funny-looking, baggy collars that were stuffed with garbage instead of straw. This is why he embraced acting. He no longer had to endure the shoulder-bending pressure of being Michael Jackson. I got to be somebody else and escape through my character, he admits. CTHE Truth is. Michael as the fretful scarecrow, was truly inspired casting that struck a chord within the performer himself. My character knows that something is wrong with the way he sees things, but he can't quite put his finger on it, he said. At the end of many of the long days of shooting, Michael had to be persuaded to step out of costume. Only begrudgingly did he return to his own identity. Why? He didn't want to look in the mirror and see old big nose. He didn't want to tote the burdensome baggage of being a lonely, confused, pimply 20-year-old, who had just completed another record album that failed to fulfill expectations. Finally skipping down the yellow brick road towards a career separate from his brothers, he didn't want to be reminded of all that he was running from. All in all, New York provided Michael with an education he couldn't have got back home. At dinner one night at the Rainbow Grill, he met Jackie Onassis. Later, he appeared at the Robert Kennedy tennis tournament, along with Muhammad Ali, Lauren Bacall and Bruce Jenner, where he was introduced to two of his fans, Caroline and John Kennedy. They talked to him for a long time about music and his dancing, publicist Steve Manning says. He also spent many wild nights at Studio 54, then the mecca of New York's socialites, where he partied and danced with such late-night luminaries as Liza Minnelli, Halston, Mick Jagger and Andy Warhol. When The Whisk came out later in 1978, and flopped at the box office, critics lambasted Ross for being too old at 34 to play the teenage Dorothy, but everyone agreed that Michael's rubber-legged dancing and satiny tenor provided the film with its most electrifying moments. But in addition to acting, the movie aided him in two ways. It served as valuable preparation for his groundbreaking music videos 5 years later. And it also introduced him to an important new acquaintance in his life. Quincy Jones, the highly acclaimed record producer and musician, was music director on The Wiz. He had been introduced to Michael years earlier by Sammy Davis Jr., a mutual acquaintance, who was enthusiastically touting Jackson as a future superstar. Jones listened, but he didn't think anything more about the comments until Michael tentatively approached him one day on the movie set and, in his own meek but formidable manner, asked, "Do you think you could find me a producer?" Single quote. Jones, saddled with the enormous task of scoring the movie, didn't give the question attention immediately. I said something like, "Don't bother me, I'm doing a movie," he laughs. But I didn't really talk that way. You don't talk that way to Michael. He's too sweet. But he was serious. Single quote. Jones had no trouble picking up on that. From watching Michael on the set, the veteran producer gained enough insight to realize that if the younger man was bold enough to crack his protective facade of silence and ask a question, he was serious. So I started to watch how he dealt with the picture, he says. He'd show up for work at 5 and be at attention the moment he was ready, waiting to work. Never complaining. Knew all his lines. Michael drilled himself until everything was second nature, and the more Jones watched him, the more he was convinced that the kid was a unique performer. At first, I admit, I thought he was just a talented bubblegum singer, says Jones. But I saw another side. Watching him in the context of being an actor, I saw a lot of things about him as a singer that rang a lot of bells. I saw a depth that was never apparent, and a commitment. I saw that Michael was growing up. Finally, I decided that if we could find some great things deep down inside him, I'd produce him.